Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wallace Collections March Seminar in the History of Collecting. As Felix has said, my name's Suzanne Higgett. I'm one of the curators at the Wallace Collection, and I'm delighted that you're with us today. I'm also really pleased to welcome today's speaker, Thomas Cooper, to talk to us about reconstructing the art collection of May Morris, 1862 to 1938. Thomas Cooper is a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. The working title of his thesis is Matters of Making, May Morris, Textiles and the Arts and Crafts Movement, circa 1880 to 1938. Thomas has been the recipient of several grants as well as a fellowship, and these have all facilitated his doctoral research in England, Wales and the Netherlands. May Morris was also the subject of Thomas's MA dissertation at the Courtauld Institute, and that was titled On the Role of Memory in the Projects of May Morris. In 2018, his MA dissertation was awarded the Courtauld's Director's Prize for Outstanding MA History of Art dissertation, and that it also resulted in a publication. Do look out for Thomas's forthcoming article in the April edition of the Burlington magazine. His article there is going to be called Arranging a Morris Room in Cardiff, Mary Lobb and the National Museum of Wales. Since 2021, Thomas has given invited lectures and papers at a number of conferences and symposia. His subjects have ranged from the arts and crafts movement, textiles and embroidery, to May Morris, considering her principally as an artist. Today, he's going to present her in a slightly different light through her art collection. During and after Thomas's talk, please do send in any questions you have for him through the Q&A. So I'm delighted now to invite you, Thomas, to present your lecture, Reconstructing the Art Collection of May Morris, 1862 to 1938. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Felix, for that really nice introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all this evening to talk about the art collection of May Morris. What I will talk about derives from my PhD research, Morris's career and work. My doctoral thesis examines her textiles, designs, making practices and writings. It seeks to understand what was invested and at stake in the making of art within Morris's own artistic practices, as well as those which she championed and imagined of others in both her contemporary and historical contexts. Morris's collecting is not the focus of my thesis. However, through the course of my research, I learned a great deal about her collecting activities and the range of artworks which she owned, lived with, and cared for. In tonight's talk, I will discuss the contents and parameters of Morris's collection. From the start, it should be noted that this is an ongoing project. We'll discover there is much about her collection presently remains unknown. Tonight's talk will comprise three parts. In the first, I introduce Morris and give a quick sketch of her career. Part 2 reconstructs her art collection. In the third and final part, I consider what this collection and its formation tell us about Morris's interests, priorities, values as a collector. As will become clear, Morris came from a famous family. For the purposes of this talk, I use Morris to refer to May Morris. When I refer to her father, William Morris, and her mother, Jane Morris, I use their first names, William and Jane. So, part 1, introducing May Morris. Foremost a designer and maker of textiles, particularly embroidery, Morris was also a jeweller, writer and teacher. Born in 1862 to parents of pre-Raphaelite and arts and crafts fame, she was a leading figure among the second generation of the arts and crafts movement. After completing her formal artistic training at the National Art Training School, now known as the Royal College of Art, she began her career in the early 1880s. Financially supported by her family's prosperous interior decorating firm, Morris and Company, she lectured on historical textiles and privately taught embroidery at home. From 1885 to 1896, she managed the embroidery workshop of the family business. In addition to designing and making company wares, she was responsible for overseeing the training and work of employees and apprentices. Morris excelled as a designer and a maker. She produced some of the finest embroideries of the late 19th century. They are noted for their conventionalized and harmonious compositions, clear and bold coloring, high-quality materials, and supreme execution in stitching. From the late 1880s, she regularly exhibited her work at prominent exhibitions of arts and crafts in Britain and in Europe, the United States of America, and New Zealand. She was also busy publishing dozens of articles for different journals and magazines. These mostly concern technical aspects of stitching and critical analyses of historical textiles from a wide range of geographies. For Morris, study of a global spectrum of artworks was critical to her practice. Throughout the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s, Morris taught at leading art schools, lectured across Britain and the United States of America. During the latter decade, she co-founded the Women's Guild of Arts. In her recent study of women and the arts and crafts movement, Zoe Thomas described the establishment of this guild in 1907 as a, quote, revolutionary moment for women art workers in England. The Guild provided its members opportunities to lecture, give expert technical demonstrations, and organise exhibitions. Above all, it was a space of sociability and collaboration. Members gathered to support and debate and inspire as they strove to raise the professional profile of women art and craft workers in the 20th century. I'm going to move that down so you can see the slide. Throughout her career, Morris travelled widely. In addition to the United States of America, visited France, Italy, Spain, the Balearic Islands, Morocco, Egypt, and Iceland. She also spent much time holidaying in the British Isles. She was particularly drawn to remote and wild locations, the Isles of Scilly, the coastlines and mountainous valleys of Wales, the moorlands of Devon, Cornwall, and Northumberland, and the islands of the Outer Hebrides. These travels are important in a consideration of Morris's collecting activities. They presented prime opportunities to acquire new kinds of artworks, which were often made locally. It was during these travels that Morris was most active as a collector. Until now, Morris has not been perceived as a collector. Rather, she has been understood as a curator, or perhaps less formally, as a custodian of her family's collection at Kelmscott Manor. Set by the upper reaches of the River Thames in rural Oxfordshire, this large 17th century stone manor was beloved by its arts and crafts occupant. The Morris family rented the house from 1871, and they used it principally as a summer retreat. Morris's mother Jane purchased the house in 1913. In 1923, Morris left her rented townhouse in London and moved permanently to the manor. This was her home until her death in 1938. The collection at Kelmscott Manor can be arranged into two broad categories. The first comprises the artworks, designs, clothes, personal possessions, and, quote, relics, end quote, made and used by members of the Morris family and their associated circle of artists and designers. people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Burne Jones, Philip Webb, and others. Morris believed that these objects constituted an important record of the arts and crafts movement and its tradition. In the 1920s and 1930s, she took efforts to secure them in a museum, such as the Victoria and Albert Museum, so that future generations could study and be inspired by them. This was arranged through specific gifts she made while she was alive and through bequests actioned by the stipulations of her will. The second category of the Kelmscott Manor collection comprises the artworks, decorative furnishings, and historical source materials which different members of the Morris family have collected since the 1870s. This category includes paintings, textiles, ceramics, metalwork, glass, and furniture. Much of these were collected by William, whose collecting practices have received some scholarly attention. But what was collected by Morris? To try to identify the contents and parameters of Morris's collection, a complicated task. It must account for a range of materials, archive sources, publications, and museum holdings. In many cases, these materials do not corroborate one another. This results in a patchy picture. Following a rough chronological structure, I'm now going to take us through some of these materials. Morris started collecting in the 1880s. In her first published essay from 1888, she described a 19th century embroidered patchwork textile from Resht, Iran, and tells us that she personally owned this item. Shown on the screen is this textile. Morris had a serious interest in Persian art. In the case of this textile, she was also interested in the use of a particular type of stitch known as chain stitch, which is used throughout the surface decoration. She retained the embroidered patchwork in her personal possession for her entire life. In 1939, it was bequeathed to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. Presently, I don't know when, where, or how she acquired this textile. It is plausible that she purchased it via an intermediary known to her through her father, who also collected textiles and was an art referee for the Victoria and Albert Museum. In the winter of 1896, Morris and her mother Jane travelled to Egypt. William had died in October of that year. Morris and Jane therefore likely went for a much-needed change of scene in a warmer climate. Whilst in Egypt, Morris purchased various textiles. She likely bought these at bazaars in Cairo, from where we know she sourced dressmaking fabric. Some of these textiles are documented in photographs taken shortly after Morris's return from Egypt in the spring of 1897. In the photograph shown here, Morris is styled in an approximation of, quote, Arab dress. Over a striped robe with open seam sleeves, she wears a dark cloak. Hung around her neck is an Egyptian assiyat scarf. A woven or embroidered veil is secured with a band on her head and hung over her shoulders. I have not yet been able to trace the textiles Morris is seen wearing in this photograph. It's believed that the cloak pictured here is the same purple cloak designed and embroidered after returning from Egypt, and which is now in the William Morris Gallery. However, this is not the case. I also want to note that the assiyat scarf shown here on the left is an example from the British Museum, made between 1875 and 1925. Two years after her visit to Egypt, Morris published an article on the subject of Coptic. These types of textiles were produced in Egypt between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE. From the mid-1880s, large quantities of textiles were discovered in archaeological excavations. These ancient textiles have been remarkably well preserved in the dry conditions of Egypt's deserts. They quickly attracted attention from collectors and scholars. Extant late antique textiles were scarce, owing to their tendency to wear and decay. The findings of vast numbers of intact Coptic textiles was revelatory, as these provided substantial material through which the history of art could be understood anew. Museums and private collectors were eager to acquire these textiles. However, their desires outstripped immediate supply. There soon emerged a market of Coptic textiles that had been looted from burial grounds and fragmented, literally cut and torn. These were distributed via networks of dealers to private collectors, as well as major museums across Europe and the United States of America. Morris was among the private collectors who purchased Coptic textile fragments. 2 of these are described in her Coptic textiles article. This is what she says, quote, "I may just note here, in passing, that one meets but little needle embroidery. What there is mostly of the later Byzantine type and without distinction. I have, however, some pieces of an earlier type, worked closely and solidly, in curious faded purple and yellow," end quote. And in another passage, there's, quote, "Among some fragments in my possession is one of fine undyed wool, like mellow ivory. Its only decoration consists of stripes, a band of dusky purple between others of pale, clear red, divided by hairlines of blue and white and green and orange. The colours are pure in quality and arranged with remarkable distinction." End quote. While it is unlikely that Morris visited active archaeological sites during her trip to Egypt, it is plausible that she purchased these fragments in Cairo, where there was a vibrant market for Coptic textiles. It is unclear from whom and where she bought her Coptic textiles. Today they remain untraced. In the stores of the William Morris Gallery are further objects that Morris might have acquired in Egypt. The first is an agal, seen in the centre of the screen. This is a men's clothing accessory worn doubled around the head to secure a textile, commonly a gutra or kefi. On the left of the screen is a photograph of Lady Anne Blunt, with whom Morris resided during her stay in Egypt, showing an agal being worn. Morris described how Blunt had given Jane a, quote, "Arab headdress," end quote, to wear, which could be the gallery's agal. A second item in the William Morris Gallery is a pair of red leather slippers embroidered with metal thread. Like the agal, these could have been acquired in Egypt. Indeed, both feature a metal thread that appears similar at first glance, although their comparison requires further analysis. Alternatively, the agal and slippers could have been collected during Morris's second trip to North Africa, when she visited the coast of Morocco during a cruise in 1913. Additionally, there is a set of 3 Ottoman sherbet spoons in the William Morris Gallery. Along with the agal and slippers, the spoons arrived at the gallery in 2011, after being transferred from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter. Prior to this transition, these items were believed to have been made in Iceland. This misattribution was based on the information provided by Morris's partner, Mary Lobb, who donated them to the museum in Exeter in 1939. Given that Lobb was Morris's partner, we might assume that she had a good knowledge of her art collection. However, in my research, I have found Lobb's reliability in attributions to be inconsistent. More research is needed to understand where and when these objects were made, as well as how they entered Morris's collection. In the accounts Morris penned of her later travels across northern Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, she recorded the local textiles that she collected. In West Wales, she purchased woven woolen shawls. In the Outer Hebrides, she purchased an indigo web of Harris tweed and a knitted cushion cover, jumper and scarf made of hand-dyed and hand-spun wool. She acquired further knitted textiles in Iceland. She visited Iceland 3 times, in 1924, 1926, and 1931. During the first trip, she bought animal skin shoes and a red and green woolen blanket known as a tepi. She was also gifted a shawl and commissioned a knitted shawl. Sadly, the whereabouts of these textiles today are unknown. Despite this, we know much more about how Morris acquired these Welsh, Hebridean, and Icelandic textiles. In her letters and diaries, she frequently recorded the names of the makers, how much she paid for the wares, and where she made her purchases. In many cases, Morris offered to pay more than the asking price. This was not done to secure a purchase against a competitive buyer. Rather, she wanted to pay the makers fairly for their labour. Following Morris's death in 1938, 2 extensive records of the contents of Kelmscott Manor were made. The first was an inventory and valuation report, completed in December 1938. This was carried out by the firm Hobbs and Chambers on behalf of Morris's lawyers, Messrs. Stevens and Sons, to account for the effects of Morris's estate for probate purposes. The second was an auction catalogue of the estate sale of Kelmscott Manor, which took place in July 1939. This catalogue was also compiled by Hobbs and Chambers. Both documents are valuable for several reasons. They give a detailed record of what was in the manor in the 1930s. In contrast to the Spartan decoration seen in the manor today, the house would have resembled something like the cluttered home of Emery Walker at 8 Hammersmith Terrace. Rooms were filled with Jacobean, Sheraton, Morrison Company, and lacquered furniture, over layers of Persian and Turkish carpets, animal skin rugs, and coconut matting. The walls were hung with tapestries, weavings, embroideries, silk hangings, and frame drawings, prints, watercolours, and oil paintings. Silverware, glassware, and ceramic plates, dishes, and bowls filled cupboards and pantries. There were books and loose sheets, tapestry frames, bundles of wool and thread for making, photo albums, pile upon pile of textiles and household linens, and boxes of jewellery and beads. In reading the inventory and valuation report, it is possible to follow a virtual tour of the manor. The report works through the house, room by room, giving us a sense of how these were arranged. Morris's workroom, known as the Green Room, for example, was furnished with a Turkish carpet, 10-foot Persian rug, brown and white skin rugs, a selection of carved chairs and a Morris easy armchair, carved Italian chests, Oriental carved oak box, Indian pipe, Mallorca bowl, and Flanders ware pot. Both the report and catalogue were viewed with caution, however. Each was created for a specific purpose, both of which present limitations in an attempt to reconstruct Morris's art collection. To start with, the inventory and valuation report does not account for everything in the manor. Comparing the contents of the report with the substantially larger contents of the estate sale catalogue affirms this. Moreover, the report was created to corroborate the bequests of Morris's will and generate a valuation of her estate. Therefore, it prioritises specific items listed in the will and those items in the manor that were deemed to be the most valuable. As a result, many of the textiles we know Morris owned are not identified in the report. Following the death of Morris's partner, Mary Lobb, in March 1939, the contents of the manor were auctioned off in an estate sale. The sale catalogue is more extensive than the inventory and valuation report in its recording of the manor's contents. For example, it pays far more attention to the hundreds of textiles in the manor, which were ignored by the inventory report. In many cases, however, the descriptions of these textiles are generic or incorrect. Terms like Oriental or Eastern were liberally applied to textiles of unspecified foreign origin. Nonetheless, the range of textiles listed in the catalogue provides some more clues as to the contents of Morris's art collection. Among the textiles listed in the catalogue, we find those that Morris purchased during her travels in Scotland, such as lengths of Harris tweed and woolen curtains and knitted shawls. But we also find in the catalogue various textiles which align with Morris's travels and collecting activities, but of which no written or photographic records survive. For instance, the catalogue includes 2 lace caps from Morocco, a black and gold Egyptian overdress, and 2 jibba, described as, quote, an Eastern hand-woven jibba, end quote, and, quote, blue Eastern jibba. It is possible that Morris purchased the Moroccan caps and Egyptian overdress during her North African travels. Indeed, the latter could be one of the textiles documented in the photographs shown earlier. It is more plausible that she acquired the 2 jibba during her visit to Egypt. Jibba are long, close-fitting cotton and woolen tunics decorated with geometric panels. These types of textiles were not produced in large quantities until the 1880s, when the jibba was developed from a Sufi maraca as the uniform for the newly emerged Mahdists in the late 19th century in what is present-day Iran. While the catalogue, therefore, indicates further items that Morris might have collected, it does not account for some of the textiles we know she owned. For example, the Resht embroidered patchwork and the agal are not documented. These are 2 examples of a large number of items from the manor that were bequeathed to museums after Morris's death, prior to the creation of the estates. For example, in the spring of 1939, the executors of Morris's estate bequeathed 130 textiles from Kelmscott Manor to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. These exclusively comprised historical embroidered and woven textiles. A wide range of geographies is represented among the bequest. Textiles from England, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Iona, Crete, Naxos, Turkey, Iran, India, and Japan. The museum's accession register describes all the textiles as, quote, part of the collection of William Morris, end quote. However, this is not entirely true. Included among the bequest was Morris's Resht embroidery. This error prompts me to question whether other items included in the bequest have been misattributed to William. With the exception of Hungary, the geographies represented through the donated items correlate with the geographical spread Morris covers in her writings and lectures. Moreover, the embroidered textiles in the bequest demonstrate a variety of stitching techniques. For example, darning, chain stitch, couching, applique, assisi work, metal thread embroidery, weaving imitation. An interest in different methods of making runs throughout Morris's publications and teaching. She would therefore have likely been attentive to the lessons to be learned from studying these textiles. In other words, she had reason to collect them. Yet while it is plausible that these textiles were part of her personal collection, at present I'm not able to confirm this. More research is needed to understand the histories of these textiles and their possession by the Morris family. What can we learn from this patchy and provisional picture of Morris's art collection? That the known contents of the collection are dominated by textiles is unsurprising. Throughout her career, Morris assiduously studied historical and contemporary textiles. The textiles she collected were instructive. She used them for her personal research, as case studies in her writings, and as handling objects in her lectures and teaching. She was fascinated by the making of objects and believed passionately in the value of engaging firsthand with the art of the past. She also wanted others to learn from the object owned. Morris's collecting was opportunistic. She made purchases and commissioned items during her travels, which were largely recreational holidays. However, in tracing the textiles that Morris acquired and purchased during these travels, it becomes clear that her collecting practices were informed by an interest in locality. Morris wanted to understand the materials, processes of manufacture, and decoration of regional art making. She sought out local products, often made by contemporary makers, whom she conversed on matters of dyeing, knitting, weaving, and stitching. Collecting for Morris was a means through which she enhanced her knowledge of textile making. She was therefore not only collecting material objects, but also knowledge. Morris's collecting practices were also motivated by a desire for authenticity. When she arrived in the Outer Hebrides in the late 1920s, she quickly purchased some blue Harris tweed. Soon after, however, she was informed that she had mistakenly bought imitation cloth, which was not hand-woven, but woven by a machine in a mill. She was vexed she had been duped into buying what she called, quote, humbug, end quote. She later went to meet a hand weaver from whom she commissioned some authentic Harris tweed. Authenticity of process mattered to Morris. She celebrated art that was made by hand and by a purposeful head of a living, thinking, and feeling maker who appreciated the qualities and limitations of materials and techniques. Many of Morris's acquisitions were made on commission from a maker whom she had met in person. Even when she was collecting historical textiles, such as the Coptic fragments, she was thinking about those from the past who had made them. And closely studying the Coptic textiles in her personal collection, she felt she was able to commune with their makers. In the case of Coptic textiles, her interest in makers reveals a selective attention, however. Morris was aware that these textiles circulating among dealers and collectors had been looted from burial grounds. This process of removal went largely unchallenged. Morris, like many of her peers, was complicit in this market of antiquities raided from gravesites. And so, some final words to conclude this evening's talk. Morris collected throughout her life, and her art collection was a significant repository for artistic writing and teaching. I have sketched out the known parameters and contents of this collection, but this reconstruction is a provisional and incomplete project. Much remains uncertain and unknown, but in paying attention to Morris's activities as a collector and the artwork she collected, we can understand more about what she valued, how she engaged with the art of the past, and how she interacted with and supported makers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas, for that really interesting survey of the kind of material that May Morris was collecting and the circumstances in which she did it, and why she did it. It's really interesting to get that rounded picture. And it'd be great if people have questions. I'll just turn on the Q&A. If anyone has any questions, please do send them in via the Q&A. There is a question already come in. Patricia Usick asks, are there any diaries from her Egypt visits?
Not that I know of, frustratingly. There are a few letters, but these, yeah, they're very few and far between. Morris's letters, most of the letters and diaries that survive tend to date from the 20th century. So sadly, she only visited Egypt once, and that was yeah, the very tail end of the 19th century. So no, sadly.
Yes, I also had a question about Egypt. I wondered if you could say something about Lady Anne Blunt, who she stayed with.
I don't know a huge amount about Lady Blunt. So she and her husband Wilfred, they owned a stud farm, which is called Sheikh Abayed, and it was located outside Cairo. And this was where Morris and Jane resided during their trip to Egypt, and they were there for about 6 months. So it was quite a long time. They arrived in November of 1896 and then left by the end of April. And this farm was huge, and it had wonderful groves of various fruits and a menagerie of animals, which Morris sort of loved and hated. They would go on excursions into the desert, and she rode a donkey, which she said she hated. But Jane was on a horse, which was much more tempered, apparently. But in Morris's letters, she doesn't really give a huge insight into Lady Anne, unfortunately. I would like to know more about her. I think a book has been published on her, and she wrote a lot of letters, so that might be worth going into. But she was fluent in Arabic, and from Anne, Morris learned the Arabic alphabet. So she was clearly someone with whom Morris had a sort of an intellectual relationship. And I think Anne was giving Jane and possibly Morris some of these Egyptian textiles, or possibly facilitating their acquisition of them.
Thank you. Lynn Hulse has asked, Thomas, have you found any references to May Morris acquiring examples of Opus Anglicanum for her own collection?
No, Lynn, I haven't. Again, sadly, I'd love that. I don't know if she owned any. She had loads of photographs of them. But I know, I sadly just don't know yet.
Oh, so would you like to say something about her collection of photographs of textiles?
Oh yeah, so she had quite a large photographic library, which is now in the Ashmolean, and it's about 150 images of largely of historical textiles, and mostly they depict opus Anglicanum, phrase that means English work, and it refers to exceptionally fine needlework that was made in England in the 13th and 14th centuries. I think I've got that right, or maybe it's the 12th and 13th. Lynn can correct me if I'm wrong, as she is far more knowledgeable on this than I am. But Morris really loved Opus Anglicanum, and it's the subject of a number of articles. It appears again and again in her writings as a sort of an ideal art of the past, to which contemporary makers should really closely look and try and absorb the ways in which they were stitching, but also how nature was represented within in these medieval artworks. She absolutely loved Opus Anglicanum. I don't know if she would have been able to acquire Opus Anglicanum because there's not a huge amount that was probably on the market, maybe, and what was known would have been kept within church treasuries. So quite a lot of the big examples of Opus Anglicanum were very large copes, which were garments that maybe a bishop or an ecclesiastical figure would wear. And these were kept within church treasuries because they were very, very made with very precious materials, sort of gold, jewels, metal threads, and silks. And they wanted to be looked after, and of course, it would also take a huge number of years to make. They were very prized.
Thank you. So we've got some questions and comments coming in. Beata Bescher says, thank you so much for this interesting compilation of material. And Mark Samuels Lassner has written a lovely presentation on a truly unknown aspect of Morris's life and work. I expect you know of the holdings in my collection at the University of Delaware, which includes letters, an early notebook, a series of drawings made when working on the collected works of William Morris, and books from Morris's library. And then he gives his email address. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I am aware of that collection, but I perhaps need to chase up the letter, so I will email you. Thank you very much.
Great. Rosa Somerville asked, do you know which parts of the Hebrides she visited? I.e., did she go to Lewis as well as Harris?
Yes, so she makes two trips to the Hebrides, 1929 and 1930. First trip in 1929, she's mostly based on Lewis and Harris. Yes, there are two names, but they are technically the same geographical landmass, and I don't really think Morris makes the distinction between the different ones. So she's principally in Lewis with Harris on that visit. She also makes a single visit to St Kilda, which is a remote archipelago, I think quite a far way out into the Atlantic Ocean. And she visits the island of Herta, which is the only populated island of St Kilda. So in that first visit, she only goes those two locations. But in the second visit, in 1930, the year later, she is principally holidaying on the island of Barra, but she does visit Lewis with Harris. She also visits Iona, Staffa, Eriskay, and maybe another, but it escapes my memory now. So she's traveling around in the second much more than the first.
Thank you. There's a question come in from YouTube here from Caroline Palmer. Have you found direct influence of individual textiles she collected on her own embroidery designs, in terms of particular motifs or compositions?
Not really, Caroline. I suppose that there is, if you're looking at the Recht embroidered patchwork on the screen there is a similarity in the way she's sort of in the way she stitches. So it's not very clear in this far out view, but the trunk of stems, for example, that emerges from the top of that vase, it's worked in sort of rows of chain stitch laid together. And in some embroidery, she works in a similar style. It's tricky because I think there are actually so few examples of these historical textiles that we can actually visualize. There's quite a lot, as I'm suggesting today, that we can imagine and we can understand she owned, but it's difficult to sort of latch on to a specific example. I found that Morris was quite flexible in transposing a motif from between media. So she might be looking at a book cover or a mosaic on a wall, and she's looking, and as she looks at those pieces of ornament or those illustrations, they're giving her material to think about design composition in various ways. I should also say that Morris was very strongly against imitation and copying, and I think it's quite rare that she would have ever endorsed sort of a direct transposition of a motif, even if something might have a resemblance to something. It was always an original creation. Nonetheless, there are definitely distinctive echoes in her own designs of Islamic medallions and Ottoman tulips and various things. So there are all these echoes. There are lots of inconclusive sort of. It's difficult to conclude exactly where she got.
Thank you. Paul Spencer Longhurst has asked, did she have particular or personal reasons to give or bequeath parts of her collection to Birmingham, apart from the obvious strength of the Pre-Raphaelite holdings at the Museum and Art Gallery there?
So the stuff got to Birmingham not by her choice. A large portion of the textiles were and furnishings of the manor were firstly given to the Victoria and Albert Museum. These were the ones that were specifically listed in Morris's bequest of her will. It seems then a few months later that various historical textiles that aren't listed in the will come into the sort of attention of the museum. They're aware that there is a collection of global historical textiles that the Morris family own. But the museum aren't really that interested in owning them. They have a look at them and they send someone up to the manor to sort of trifle through them. But by that point, so this is the late 1930s, the V&A have already a huge global textile collection filled with representatives of highest standard. Unfortunately, a lot of the textiles in Birmingham are actually quite poor standard. A lot of them are decayed, torn. The patchwork quilt is actually quite a mess at the back that you're seeing there. So the V&A have always had quite a high standard in their policy acquisitions. They always want to collect the best example artwork. And so my sense is that they looked upon this collection and thought, this isn't really what we want. But then one of the curators at Birmingham, who I think was on the board of trustees at the V&A, or he was on some board connected to it, I can't remember exactly now, but he becomes aware of the textiles that are being discussed. And he asks if they can be donated to Birmingham, and the executor of Morris's estate consents to that. End up in Birmingham.
Thank you. And Diana Davis says, thank you for an illuminating presentation. Do you know how May Morris displayed the textiles she collected at Kelmscott?
Not the textiles I've been talking about today, no. I think there are lots of photographs that have been taken of Kelmscott Manor around I think after William's death. And in many cases, there are lots of textiles which are hung on the walls. And because Morris was very, very keen on looking at caring for the manor and keeping alive the memory of William and receiving a sort of constant stream of pilgrims and guests who wanted to come see where the great William Morris lived. I imagine she would have kept the textiles that he had hung in in their place. But as I said, a lot of the textiles that are in Birmingham, for example, that were fragmentary, the letters in the V&A describe them being kept within a wooden trunk. And there was just so much material in the manor upon Morris's death. I think there would have been textiles everywhere. So they would have been hung on the wall, draped over furniture, but also stored in trunks. A variety of locations.
So do you know how she would have looked after, sort of conserved them, avoided things like moths, that kind of thing?
No, actually, it doesn't. I haven't come across any references to that. I imagine she would have cared for them as best she knew how and wanted to, because she kept them in her possession for all of her life. So the rest embroidery there, as I said, she had it by 1888 and she kept it for the next 50 years. So she did look after things, but I don't know how much of a concern this was. Yeah,
it's interesting. It must have been a slightly challenging aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
Wool, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we've got a question here from I think probably somebody from somebody Icelandic. So I'm going to attempt the surname, but apologies if I pronounce it incorrectly. From Gudrun Svenbjarnadottir, who asks, where are her letters and diaries for her trips to Iceland kept?
So those are, well, the various letters are sort of all over the place. There are some in the William Morris Gallery. That's where a lot of them are. And then the Society of Antiquaries, diaries and letters.
Thank you. How did they get to the antiquaries?
That I don't fully know, actually. I wouldn't be able to answer that.
That's really interesting. And Patricia Davis asks, was she not acquainted with the chain stitch prior to her travels? And thank you for an interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you. Yes, definitely she would have been acquainted with it. Morris started to embroider at quite a young age. Her mother and her aunt were very accomplished needlewomen, and her father was consonant with stitching. So yes, she definitely would have known about chain stitch before she went on course.
Thank you. Kristin Kieser, wonderful lecture, thank you. Are any of May Morris's patterns available today for modern embroiderers?
I don't know if there are any sort of on the open market to buy. I think some people have worked them up onto a sort of digital sheet. I think it's Sally Roberson who does a lot of work with the William Morris Society. She's made some kits and transposed the patterns, but I think it's sort of have to do it yourself sort of approach, and through photographs and surviving examples.
Mind you, it might be a good idea for the Kelmscott shop, of course.
Yeah, I don't know if they sell Sally's kits. They probably do.
Yeah, not being an embroiderer, I didn't notice when I visited, so it's an interesting idea. And then Cynthia Gamble says, thank you for a fascinating lecture. Could you say something about May Morris's circle of friends?
Yeah, it was huge. She was incredibly well connected, and she really was perhaps the leading woman of the arts and crafts. And she was involved with the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society from its inception, and often was the only woman among its list of contributors to its publications, especially in the early days. Her family was sort of at the heart of the arts and crafts scene, and she was a member of the Socialist League in the 1880s, and the house that her and her family lived in was a sort of centre for rallies and talks and lectures. So she was an incredibly well-connected woman. I don't know a huge amount about her like, friends per se. When she was younger, but towards in her later life, she has a very close relationship with Sidney Cockerell, who started as a secretary for Kelmscott Press in the 1890s and went on to become the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. She's very close with his family. He is among a select few people whom she corresponds with all the time. Others include Emery Walker, Dorothy Walker, the various members of the Women's Guild of Arts, including Kate Whitaker. So yeah, she knew a lot of people.
Thank you. And then Anne Kopka asks, was Morris a photographer?
I have no evidence to say that she was, so I don't know. I think it was Mary Lobb, her partner, who was taking the photographs on the holiday. Certainly for the early Iceland trips. I think the last trip they take to Iceland, they go with two sisters from America, and I think it's one of the sisters. So I don't have any evidence that says she was a photographer, but she could have been.
Thank you. And then Chris Smith asks, was she able to locate the archaeologically, I think, sourced textiles such as Coptic in their own context, in time and geographical context? So
as I was saying, that's something I haven't figured out. I think it's unlikely. In her Coptic textiles article, she describes some of these archaeological sites, but I don't think she went there to them. For example, she talks about a particular site called Akhmim, which is quite far up the Nile, much further south than Cairo. And I've been able to track a few of Morris's movements in Cairo. She visits a few sort of temple sites and grave sites, and she does a few excursions in and around Cairo, but there's no evidence to indicate that she made quite a lengthy trip up the Nile to Akhmim. But nonetheless, she could have done that because there was a very steady flow of tourist traffic up the Nile in steamboats and sail power boats. So it's absolutely plausible that she could have gone there. And she was in Egypt for a substantial enough amount of time. But I just don't know. My feeling is that she didn't. There was such a big market for Coptic textiles, and there were various dealers, British dealers based in Egypt, who were acquiring textiles and then sort of selling them on to the V&A and other museums. So I imagine it would have been through these dealers that Morris got the Coptic textiles.
And I have a feeling that Chris meant with the question as well, when she acquired things that had been they came from archaeological sites, was she able to, did she have the knowledge to place them in time and in geographical context?
Oh, I see. Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Well, what you said was really interesting, but I suspect that the question was also about that.
Yes, is the answer to that. So within the article, she's talking about, she gives quite a lot of attention to what she calls the different stages of Coptic art. Off the top of my head, they evade me. but she sort of she differentiates those three sections by looking at the use of color, the use of line, various motifs and figures within the textiles. And she is definitely in the V&A looking at their huge amount of Coptic textiles, because the article is illustrated by, I think it's 18 textiles, all of which come from the V&A collection. So she is definitely looking at them very closely and can position them within sort of an art historical lineage and understand their production in Egypt at a particular time when it is a Christianized province of the Roman Empire and a sort of melting pot of various external or foreign influences, principally of motif, but also of materials and technique. He absolutely is understanding these within a historical and geographical.
Great, thank you. And the last two kind of comments that I've got so at the moment are two people very kindly responding to the question about how material came to be at the Society of Antiquaries, Mark Samuels Lassner and Peter Street. So I'll read out Mark Samuels Lassner's comment. He says the Society of Antiquaries was the residual legatee in Morris's will. Kelmscott Manor and its contents came to the Society after the original inheritor, Oxford University, decided that her property was too difficult to keep up. This is an extremely truncated comment. There's a full explanation by A.R. Duffy in the Antiquaries Journal from about 50 years ago. So obviously there's quite a lot of information about that with the Antiquaries, which is interesting. So I don't have any more questions or comments, or no, I have. Barbara Waronko writes, in the Women's Guild programme, she is listed as giving a talk on pageants. Did she have any involvement in any of the historical pageants that were so popular at the time?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think Morris did have quite an extended interest in pageants. It's a topic of lectures she gives quite regularly in Britain and in the US. And among her lecture slides, she had a box written on it, pageants. I think she's mostly interested in the costumes within them, but it's something I haven't actually explored much, and would be a really, really good topic to do. I don't know much about the wider interest in pageants. I would love to hear from you. What's your name? Barbara. And yeah, feel free to email me. I don't know if the email is on, is the email on the description on the website, Suzanne? My email?
Not yours, but
okay.
Ours, and the slide that you're going to put up, in a minute,
yeah.
Does have the email to contact us, unless
I'll just put my email in the chat, Barbara. If you want to email me, no pressure at all, but feel free to. That'd be really good.
Yeah. I can try opening the chat, but I think it's disabled on. Oh no, it's there. It is there. So I don't know whether people can see it. So it's a lowercase tc and then 578@cam.uk. But certainly, if you haven't picked it up and you didn't catch that, if you contact us at the email address you'll see in a moment, and the slide Thomas is kindly going to put up, then we can certainly put you in touch with Thomas. Oh yes, and Barbara has sent her email address, which you can probably, I think you can see, Thomas, you can see Barbara's email address.
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, and I think that is the last of the questions. Oh, no,
I think there was one raised hand, Suzanne, from Sheila Quayle.
Now let's see what happens when I click there.
Oh, 3 participants raised hand.
Now I'm not.
Shall I look?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Okay.
I'm not sure if the function's going to work.
Oh, here we go. Oh yeah, there's 2 from Suzanne. Are you happy for me to unmute people?
Yes, that's fine if you know. Yeah.
Okay. Patricia Usyk, I'm gonna sort of allow you to talk. So feel free to ask to unmute. Feel free to ask your question if you can.
Sorry, I wasn't asking a question, but actually I just wanted to thank you for a very interesting lecture. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, I'll go to the other raised hand. Nigel Mullen.
So are you able to unmute him?
Yeah, I've asked him to unmute.
All right. That's great.
Hello again, just a comment, just to thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
That's great. And Shella Quayle is saying, sorry, she raised her hand by accident. Excellent talk, thank you. And Chris Smith has said, very illuminating and most interesting. So unless you're seeing anything more, I think that probably brings us to the end of the Q&A, does it?
Yeah, I can't see any more.
Okay, that's great. So if you're happy to put up the next slide, that would be really helpful.
There we are.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of the Q&A. And if you'd like to join the Wallace Collections History of Collecting mailing list and receive our seminar programme for 2023, in addition to an abstract for each of the seminars in advance, then please contact us at collection@wallacecollection.org. And you can see that email address down the bottom of the slide that Thomas has put up. The seminars in the history of collecting are going to remain on Zoom until next month. So definitely next month's seminar is going to be online only. And it's going to take place on Zoom at 5:30 on Monday, the 17th of April, when Dr. Diana Davis, an independent researcher, is going to present her lecture, Fertile in Resources and in Ingenious Devices, Ferdinand de Rothschild and his dealers revealed through the archive. So once again, Thomas, thank you for a really fascinating presentation that led to a lot of really interesting questions and comments and information. So that was really great. And on behalf of the Wallace Collection, thank you all very much for attending this seminar. So we hope to see you at future seminars, at other online Wallace Collection events, and of course in person at the Wallace Collection. And we've got a new exhibition opening on the 29th of March, so in a couple of days' time, Faithful and Fearless, Portraits of Dogs from Gainsborough to Hockney. And alongside that, there is a small display on the ground floor at the Wallace Collection of photographs of the Queen and her corgis. So we hope maybe to see you at the Wallace Collection, maybe at the exhibition, maybe at the display, and maybe online. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Goodbye.